Welcome to By George, an 80 Players podcast here at the George Theater. I am your host and marketing associate, Miranda Zapes, and today I have with me...
Hi there, I am Jonathan Kraft, and I am the music director and conductor for the current production of Fiddler on the Roof at the George Theater.
I am so glad to have you here today. I'm so excited. I know almost nothing about music, even though I live with a musical theater performer and music director. She's done a couple of things, but it is just a completely different world, and I'm so excited to get to kind of take a peek into it, understand it a little bit more.
Absolutely. I'm happy to teach you everything I know. It'll probably take about 45 minutes, so let's dive right in.
Well, first, I want to know a little bit more about you. So what got you into music? I don't want to say just in theater in general, because you music direct a bunch of other things, but what was that process getting into it?
I don't know that there was really necessarily a process in which I quote unquote got into it. It just kind of seemed like something I always gravitated to. The story that my mom loved to tell was I took piano lessons whenever I was going to the pre-K daycare camp thing.
Yeah.
And then when I went to kindergarten, I went to a new school, but then I went back to that pre-K daycare camp thing for spring break or something while they were still working, but I was out of school, and I saw that piano teacher again, and apparently I went up to her and said, "Mrs. Clampett, I want to take piano lessons. You call my mother."
Oh, wow.
And that was pretty much all it took. I started taking official piano lessons a little bit before kindergarten, and then took piano lessons all the way into college. And then when I was in 6th grade, I started playing French horn in the band.
Okay.
And was a French horn player all the way through middle school, high school, went to college for French horn performance, went to some grad school for French horn performance. And then my senior year of high school, I had a hole in my schedule. I knew I was going to be going into music as my major in college. And so I was like, well, I guess I could fill this hole by taking choir. Why not? And it wound up being an incredibly good and positive and fun and enjoyable experience. And so I sang in choirs through college and into grad school, did voice lessons here and there, took voice lessons with an Opera Institute person in my undergrad, did some voice lessons with some folks around town once I got out of school and I was just trying to gig and get jobs. And you heard me mention that my college degrees were in French horn performance.
Right.
But it was the kind of thing where when I got out of school and I was trying to get work, for every single French horn related thing I was getting called for, I was getting called for 10 piano gigs, in a ratio of 10 to 1. And so I just did that for enough years that eventually my piano chops kind of far outpaced my French horn chops.
Yeah.
And then in 2019, after trying for a couple years, I finally broke into the national tour circuit and was hired to be the associate music director on the national tour of a little Broadway musical called Cats.
Oh my goodness.
Don't know if anybody's heard of that fun little show that's been around since 1984 or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I sort of had a very all of a sudden breaking into that, where they hired me in the middle of the tour to be one of 2 conductors for the show and one of 3 or 4 keyboard players for the show. And when that came around, it just kind of felt like the universe being you are officially all in as a musical theater keyboard player, conductor, music director type, and you may just need to let the French horn go a little bit if you want to make the space for this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's something that will always be a part of me. And I love just any time there's music with really great French horn writing. I love stuff like that. But yeah, in the last several years have sort of gone all in as a primarily musical theater conductor, music director, keyboard player, and so on and so forth. So that is the incredibly short version of my backstory here.
No, thank you for kind of speeding through it, but that's incredible. I'm assuming you still play French horn in your spare time, or?
I took it out of the case for the first time since 2019, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, just to see if I could still make a sound. And I, to my credit, was still able to make a sound. It was a little bit wobbly because I hadn't actually even taken it out of the case in about 5 years. But yeah, it is still in its case in my music room at home. I think at some point in my future history here, I'm going to get back into trying to play semi-regularly. But at this point in the game, I love what I'm doing as far as conducting shows. I love what I'm doing as far as playing piano and keyboard for shows. And it would take some designated time to really sort of practice it again and get my chops back going if I was going to really play competitively. So I'm sort of having to accept that if and when I do go back to it, it'll probably be more in the community band type scenario at first, and that's okay. But yeah, as of right now, I'm sort of all in on the piano and conducting side of things.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So being a conductor, was that any part of your schooling, or?
It wasn't necessarily something that I wanted to do at first. I did have to take a year of conducting classes in my undergrad just as part of my degree.
Gotcha, okay.
And then I remember taking maybe like a couple of months worth of conductor classes in grad school, but it was never anything that I set out to do. And the way that I sort of just arrived at that was like, again, I started off getting, 10 piano gigs for every French horn gig that I was getting called for. And eventually I was asked to piano conduct a show, which is where you're playing the show on the piano while simultaneously conducting with, if you have a hand free, you use a free hand, but it's a whole lot of like facial expression and like head movement and breath cues and stuff like that. And so I had to do that for the first time. And the first couple times I have no shame in admitting I was not very good at it,
Yeah.
but like, it was like, oh, this is really kind of fun. And whenever I like move my head like this, the band kind of follows me and like, oh, the singers are getting behind. So I can really like dig in and play a little bit harder and the band follows me and like, oh, okay, this might be kind of fun.
Yeah.
And so being the piano conductor, but not necessarily yet the music director, led to music directing shows in which I would like piano conduct shows that I was also music directing. And then back in 2013 or 2014, I was playing French horn, as it were, in a community band. And I'm sorry to say, had our artistic director died very unexpectedly. And so I kind of stepped up to the plate and conducted. I think we split about half of the concert with me conducting half and then the associate director conducting the other half. And that was my sort of entree into stick conducting.
Yeah.
And by that point, I knew it was something that I really, really enjoyed a lot,
Yeah.
something that I wanted to do more of, but something I really didn't know how I would create the opportunities necessary to do it, because like I had gotten degrees in French horn performance, not orchestral conducting, not choral conducting. And so I was like, well, I love doing this. I'm going to just hope that maybe the universe will unfold in my favor and I'll get a chance to. And then that was when the associate conductor job on the Cats tour opened up, and I was contacted by the contractor who had been looking at me for a couple of other shows but hadn't found something to hire me for yet.
Yeah.
And she called me up just out of the blue and was like, so we're going to be hiring for the AMD chair. Do you have any stick conducting experience? And like, I just sort of like melted whenever she said that, because like, well, I've piano conducted a lot of stuff and I've stick conducted a wind ensemble thing, but I've never stick conducted a show. I don't know if that is going to immediately take me out of the running. And, to her credit, and, for something I'm very grateful for here, she was like, well, let's just like get yourself on tape. Like, let's see what you can do conducting through memory from Cats. And, we'll take a look, and if it works, great. And if it doesn't work, great. And so I just assumed that was going to be the end of it. Like, I was competing with folks who've conducted on Broadway. I'm like, okay, I'm incredibly flattered to be looked at for this, but this isn't actually going to go anywhere, is it? And so I get off the phone with her and immediately call a contact of mine who conducts a lot of the shows down at Theater Under the Stars, down at the Hobby Center, and was like, hey, Steven, I need a conducting lesson in the next like 24 hours because I'm under a like 48 to 72 hour deadline to like submit for this incredible job.
Yeah.
Can I meet you for a conducting lesson later today? And like, to his credit, and again, I'm incredibly grateful, he did let me come over to his house and gave me a conducting lesson on the thing I was supposed to put on tape. And I was also connected with a gentleman who I would now consider my conducting mentor. His name is David Andrews Rogers, and he has conducted so many national tours, and I think most recently he was the conductor on the national tour of My Fair Lady that was going around the country.
Oh, okay.
And I was introduced to him through a mutual friend of ours, and he just sort of threw an encyclopedia at me over the phone for about 30 minutes. And I was like, okay, well, I've had this conducting lesson. I've had the encyclopedia thrown at me for, conducting national tours. Let me just go home and like put on Memory from Cats and just try to conduct my absolute best, see if I can maybe be in the running for this job. But still very low expectations. This is probably just a formality. I don't think they're going to go for somebody as green as I am.
Yeah.
And so, got it on tape and then sent it in. And about 24 hours later, I was driving to my job up at Sam Houston. It was about 10 minutes away. Contractor called me and she goes, well, Jonathan, I'm calling to offer you a job. And I had to pull my car over because I just started screaming and sobbing. And it was one of the most memorable days of my entire life because it was like, okay, in 2 weeks or so, you're going to fly out to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And a couple weeks after that, you're going to be conducting the national tour of Cats the Musical.
Yeah.
And so a combination of absolutely terrified and
Yeah, of
absolutely just
course.
elated. And then I had to deal with the fact that it was like, oh, I'm going to have to leave my home there's like 8 months left on the contract and I'm going to be away from Houston. And like I had gigs lined up in Houston for the next 6 months. And oh God, I've got like 2 weeks to arrange for replacements on myself. But oh my God, I'm going to get to go conduct the national tour of Cats the Musical, which was the first musical I ever saw live. And I've been listening to it since I was like 5 years old. And oh my God, somebody pinch me. This is a dream come true. And so, yeah, then I got on that tour and was conducting the show. On that first Cats tour, I think I was conducting 2 shows every week or something like that. And then a little thing called the pandemic happened and we all got sent home. But then I went out again on the second national tour of Cats. That was in the first cohort of shows to go out after the COVID pandemic when, I mean, it was still happening, but like we were among the first to go back out as COVID was still very much a thing. And at that point, yeah, I was conducting the show 2 times a week for about 10 months. And there was a fun little moment in January of 2022 where we had a COVID outbreak within the company. And one of the first people to go down and have to go into quarantine was unfortunately our music director.
Yeah.
So little old me had to step up to the plate and conduct every single show for about a week and a half until he came out of quarantine. And that was definitely a memorable experience because every day we'd show up to work and every day a couple more people would have tested positive. And like, I think when it was as bad as it got during that outbreak, we had 17 people in the company out and in quarantine with COVID. I don't know how we were still able to do the show because we had every single swing and understudy on. We had lost our guitar player and had kind of flown in a guitar player last minute who was sight reading the show. And there was little old me making my music director debut on a Broadway tour during a COVID emergency. And like I was on the phone with our music director guy, just being like, okay, here are the things that went wrong today. What are we going to do to make that better tomorrow? And like, here's what I think is working and I'm going to try to do more of. And like, also, boy, I can't wait until you're cleared to come out of quarantine because this is stressful. And then, yeah, until Fiddler on the Roof, Cats was the only musical that I had stick conducted because, again, it seemed like the shows that I was getting called for, like, for instance, Forever Plaid that 80 Players produced back in the fall, that's a piano conductor show. And so I music directed that and piano conducted it, which, you know, was fun and all. But, again, I was really, really looking for another opportunity to stick conduct a show. And then back in December, Kevin Dean called me up and was like, well, we had a music director lined up for Fiddler, but unfortunately, she had to back out. She got an awesome new job, and I think he said, Boston, I know you said you were maybe hoping to be involved in some capacity, but would you consider maybe taking on the music director-conductor job? And I was like, hang on a second, Kevin, let me just put the phone down. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Yes, Kevin, I would be delighted to take on this job. Thank you so much for thinking of me.
My goodness, hearing the whole story is the opportunities, I know, and I know you've worked hard, but just everything seemed to line up perfectly and like give you this opportunity, even though you were like completely stressed out and anxious about it, but that you went along with these opportunities and these doors that opened. That is incredible.
Yes.
So, music directing, you got called in December.
I did.
And so, was you getting a call in December a late notice? Would you have wished that you had had more time to prep for music directing?
Yeah, so a couple different ways I can answer that question.
Yeah.
As far as was that late notice, not really. I mean, we went into rehearsals on May 28th, and I got the call maybe December 27th or something like that. So, you know, we're still talking like 5 months plus of notice. So, I mean, that was not necessarily what I would consider late notice. If I'd gotten the call in maybe like April or something, that'd be a different story because by that point, I probably would have already lined up other summer work. But at that point, nothing had really come up. And so I was only thrilled to get that call, and I cleared my schedule, and that was the end of that. As far as was that enough time to start prepping the show, I will go on record as saying that Fiddler on the Roof is one of my top 3 favorite musicals of all time. Like right up there with Sunday in the Park with George and Please Don't Roll Your Eyes. Phantom of the Opera is like, I love all 3 of those shows. Fiddler, however, was the first musical I ever did when I was
going to say,
Yep. I was 15 years old. I was a freshman in high school. You remember me saying that I was a band kid. So, I was all in on the French horn playing side of things. And that year, Klein Oak High School was producing Fiddler on the Roof. And they used like the high school band and orchestra kids to do the music for that production. They passed me up to play the French horn book because they wanted to put a 12th grader on it, which, at the time I was like, oh man, I got passed up for this senior. That stinks. But they knew that there was a really important accordion book for this show. And they knew that I had experience playing piano. So they asked me, would I be willing to play the accordion book on a synthesizer?
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, great. If I can't play the French horn book, I'd be delighted to play accordion book, you say? Sure, why not?
Yeah.
And my goodness, it was arguably the most fun I'd ever had in my entire life up until that point. And, I may not be able to remember what I was doing a week and a half ago, but my memories of that freshman year production of Fiddler on the Roof at Klein Oak High School are absolutely seared into my memory. Yeah. I can still remember Jim Macaluso was a senior playing Tevye, and in the second performance, he skipped a verse in If I Were a Rich Man, and our conductor had to whisper shout measure numbers. It was like, he's at measure 36. He's at measure 37. He's at measure 38, and eventually we caught back on, but then he went back to get the verse that he skipped, and so poor Miss Abbott had to once again, okay, he's at measure 16. He's at measure 17. I can remember that. I can remember, that show from whenever I was 15 years old as if it was last year or something like that.
Exactly.
And I mean, it's also worth mentioning what a formative experience playing the accordion book on a keyboard was for me, because there I am at 15 years old playing, keyboard for a musical, and, fast forward, all these years later, and what is my sort of primary source of income? Playing keyboards for musicals. And so that was the first time I ever did something that would go on to become my profession, even though I really did not know that at the time.
Yeah.
And Fiddler on the Roof is also the show that I have played the most number of productions of.
Yeah.
Not performances, because I think with Cats, I cracked 500 shows total that I played. But with Fiddler, this production at 80 players is my 5th production of Fiddler, including that one when I was 15 years old. So I kind of came into this production of Fiddler on the Roof very, very, very familiar with the show. So there wasn't a lot of prep that I necessarily felt like I needed to do, because the show has just been sort of living in my head since I was 15 years old.
Yeah.
And it was really just a matter of okay, let me identify what is going to be unique to this production. Let me take a look at this cast that I kind of inherited, because again, I didn't start off as the music director for the show, so I had nothing to do with any of the auditions.
Yeah.
So I just sort of inherited this. And it was okay, well, I don't really know who these out-of-towners are that are going to play Tevye and Golden. I'm just going to trust that they're amazing, and I will admit to doing some cursory Facebook stalking of them to check out their bona fides and oh, okay, our Tevye did the Yiddish off-Broadway Fiddler on the Roof for a couple years. I think we're going to be fine.
He's got it, yeah.
But then I knew a sizable contingent of the ensemble, because most of them from Sam Houston State University, and I've been working there for the last several years, and I've actually music directed a good handful of the ensemble here. And so it was really just a matter of identifying what might be unique to this production, and then figuring out who was going to be in the orchestra, who was going to be the rehearsal pianist. And then, I did have to do some work figuring out how am I going to conduct this show, because Fiddler on the Roof is a very different show to stick conduct than Cats the musical, because that one is very much just a 5, 6, 7, 8, Jellicles can and Jellicles do, and then you just kind of go with the groove. But with this one, there's a whole lot of do you love me? Do I what? Do you love me? And that sort of rich, golden agey, what I call follow-issimo, because you're having to follow the singers a lot more.
Yeah.
So there was definitely some work that I tried to do in advance, as far as okay, everything I know from Cats the Musical, I'm going to have in the background as sort of prologue, but I'm going to treat this as a completely new and different show, because it is a completely new and different show.
Yeah. So, okay, I'm glad that you answered that, coming into this with a cast already kind of compiled together and inheriting that and doing your homework on it. But let's jump back a little bit. What exactly is music directing? And I'm already kind of seeing what you're putting into it and the research that you're doing. But when you get into rehearsal, what are you looking for and hearing for?
Yeah. So that's a bit of a two-part question, it sounds
Okay,
like. Let's
yeah.
start with what is music directing?
Definitely.
In short, I would say that it is being responsible for all of the musical elements of a given production, be it musical theater, be it a one-person show. You are essentially in charge for the integrity of the music, the quality of the music. Your job is to like do everything that you can to come in and be able to effectively teach it to the other individuals and synthesize it into the vision that the creative team has, and then make sure that it's performed to the highest possible quality as consistently as you possibly can.
Yeah.
Is sort of the like very, very short, all-encompassing definition. And then you asked about my process, and that is a very broad question, and there are textbooks written about like what a music director's process is and should be and should look like. And I will say it's very different from show to show, because the last thing that I worked on here at 80 Players was Forever Plaid, which was a wildly different show than Fiddler on the Roof. Because, I mean, that one was just a 4-person cast, 90-minute show that is sort of like, I hesitate to call it a jukebox musical. It's more of a like cover band musical in the style of like 50s and 60s doo-wop. And crazy difficult harmony. Like that was something that we had to be very, very careful about whenever we auditioned, because that show will sink or swim based on the blend of these 4 voices together. And like, you know, the melody is the melody. So you've got one person of the 4 who's always going to be on the melody, but like the lower 2, 3, 4 voices generally can be a little bit weird in order to make the harmony work. And so like we had to really be careful about casting really awesome musicians who had great ears, who could hold down complicated harmony. And so for that, my process was like months in advance, like going through and identifying, okay, who is going to sing on which line. And then I actually took one of the cast recordings for Forever Plaid and like made 4 sets of individual plunk tracks or practice tracks for like each character. So like, okay, here is the Sparky set of tracks. And like I took the original cast recording and like dinged out on an electric piano, this is Sparky's notes through these songs. And then the same thing for Jinx, and then the same thing for Frankie, and then the same thing for Smudge. And so it was pretty labor intensive up front, because we only had 3 weeks to like rehearse the show. And so I needed them to be as prepared as they possibly could be coming in. And part of my job as music director was facilitating that and not leaving it up to chance or leaving them up to their own devices. It was sort of figuring out from 10,000 feet in the air, how are we going to do this? You know, what is going to be the easiest and like most effective way to teach the cast, you know, these crazy hard harmony parts. Here are practice recordings. Practice these for a month, and then we'll get together on the first rehearsal, and we will throw it together in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So, yeah, with Fiddler, it was a much simpler process vocally, because the music, the like songs in Fiddler are nowhere near the complexity that Forever Plaid was.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely some 4-part harmony, and you know, there was figuring out, okay, who is going to sing the soprano part? That's the highest female voice. Who's going to sing the alto part, which is the lower female voice that's maybe a little bit crunchier, gnarlier because it's not the melody? Who's going to sing the tenor part? And a couple of songs in like Fiddler like get kind of high on the tenor line. So who do I know can sing those high notes? And then who's going to sing the bass, which is just, you know, only gets low in one moment in the show. So we need a few people who have some low Fs, but like by and large, it's just like a little bit lower than the tenor part. So who can hold down that harmony? So yeah, it's a lot of figuring out who is best suited for like which voice part. And then one thing that I always try to do for any show I music direct is I always try to start with the most difficult song first. So that way, if we have 3 weeks of rehearsal or 4 weeks of rehearsal, you're getting that out of the way and laying down the foundation first. And then you can go back and review it a few days later, and then review it a few days later. And then you might run Act 1 and you do it in the course of running Act 1. And then you get to the designer run and you do it again in the course of that. And so it's just, you make sure that you set up your rehearsal order in a way that you're going to be drilling the most difficult things the most frequently and the most often.
Yeah.
And you really want to try to get everything figured out in advance so that you can just sort of like disseminate information to everybody on day one, which means that you do have to kind of front load your preparation and your work, but it usually pays off in the end, because like we were able to do Forever Plaid with great success on only 3 weeks of rehearsal. We had 4 weeks of rehearsal for Fiddler, and like, yeah, by the time we went into tech, like everybody just sort of knew the songs cold. And like, I didn't have to be like, remember what your notes are in this one section, altos, or remember not to go too high there, tenors. And like, so you do everything you can to make people's lives easy and to set them up for success as best as you can. I don't know what your question was, but I just talked a lot.
No. I love all of this information because I was going to ask about Forever Plaid as well.
Yeah.
And so I was actually under the assumption that Fiddler was going to be so much more difficult because it just has a larger cast and it's a lot longer show. But it sounds like there's a lot more complexities in Forever Plaid, and that's what made it, I'm hearing, more challenging, or what would you say?
I should qualify that because like I'm kind of like twitching here when I hear you say that Fiddler is like more complex than Forever Plaid, or less complex than Forever Plaid. Kind of repeating my words back to me here. Fiddler is differently complex than Forever Plaid because Forever Plaid was 4-person cast, singing 100% of the show, 90 minutes, no intermission originally, but we went ahead and like put in an intermission just to, you know, give people a chance to breathe and go to the bathroom and like reset some like staging and prop stuff. Fiddler is differently complicated because it's a much longer show. Like it, you know, we've been clocking in at like 3 hours and 1 minute, or like 2 hours and 59 minutes. We're like right on the cusp of 3 hours. It is a much bigger cast, and it's a much more orchestrally oriented score. Because Forever Plaid, piano, bass, and drums, that was it. That was all it was scored for. That was all that we had to really like manage. And like the bass and the drum part just kind of followed the piano part. I piano conducted. And so really the difficulty was just making sure that these 4 guys could hold down their 4-part harmony through 90 minutes worth of a show.
Yeah.
Fiddler on the Roof is a different animal. And like, I would say, just from my vantage point, the single biggest difference is adding in a full orchestra.
Right.
Because we have, oh God, let's see if I can remember this off the top of my head. We have me conducting, then we have a violinist, a cello player, clarinet player, flute player, a guitar and mandolin player, a bass player, an accordion player, 2 trumpets, trombone, and a percussionist. So that's a lot of different sounds to manage. That's a lot of different sort of just like styles to kind of fuse together. And again, I'm stick conducting this one as opposed to piano conducting like I did for Forever Plaid.
Right.
And it's not just that you have to stick conduct an orchestra, because it could be said that Fiddler on the Roof is more of a folk music show.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the concept of Judaism is so incredibly integral to this show, it makes sense that, like, the music for the show would be so heavily, like, klezmer influenced. And, like, there are moments where it sort of leans pretty heavily into just sort of boilerplate musical theater, but, like, there are so many moments through the show that really go all in as far as that very sort of idiomatic klezmer sound. And so you really have to get that right. And that's not just something that you can like hire any musician off the street to play, even a really talented musician. You really have to make sure that you get the right combination of the right people who have experience doing this kind of stuff. And like, not to single anybody out, but I've got to give major props to our clarinet player, Doug Wright, because I mean, if you've seen the show, you've heard what Doug does and how he makes that clarinet absolutely sing. And I mean, clarinet and especially accordion as well are super important in like klezmer music, you know, as well as obviously with the show being Fiddler on the Roof, like the violin book is also incredibly important. And so it took some real care for us to go in and pick musicians for the show that we knew would be great human beings to like hang out in a tight and closed space with for 6 weeks, 6 shows a week, who are also great musicians who we know we could put anything in front of them and they'd be able to like throw down on it, but who also would be able to really get in touch with this like klezmer style and idiom. And, you know, I'll give Doug credit because he also plays clarinet at Congregation Beth Israel in Meyerland. Okay. So, yeah, he very much is familiar with this particular style. Yeah. And so, yeah, didn't have to deal with any of that on Forever Plaid. Yeah. And then another interesting component is just the size of the ensemble because, again, Forever Plaid had 4 people that were singing at any given time. And oh God, I don't know the total number in the like company and the ensemble off the top of my head, but it's in the ballpark of I think like 30 people. And so you get a big splashy opening number like Tradition. And I mean, going back to like, what is your process for music directing and how do you prepare?
Yeah.
When you're working with big ensembles like this, you have to think of it almost like you would leading a choir, because sort of a key tenet of like choral singing is you want releases to be at the exact same time, especially whenever like a word releases on a consonant, because like, let's just take the word tradition, for instance, because, you know, if you want to really hit the end of that tradition, you really want that last n to be at the exact same time across all 30 people. Otherwise, you get tradition, tradition,
Yeah.
right? And so that's, you know, part of my detail work as far as like, okay, everyone in the ensemble, we're going to really release this right on the bar line. So tradition, tradition, like right with the beat.
Yeah.
Because if everybody is doing that, it'll sound like one single release as opposed to a tradition,
Yeah.
which is something that you want. And that is not something I really had to deal with on Forever Plaid when it was just 4 people, because they could just like, you know, send out their field of attention to the other 3, and mostly they were very fine.
Yeah.
But then this one, we've got like some folks singing off stage. We've got folks singing like in different areas of the stage. And so part of my detail work was figuring out, how do we make this work and sound effective like across this many people spread over this much space with this much going on. So all of which is to say, that's a very long way of answering. Fiddler on the Roof is Fiddler on the Roof is very differently complicated from Forever Plaid.
Definitely. No, I see it now. And that was, I'm glad that you brought up the tradition, because I had told you in the questions I was going to ask, I went to the first rehearsal.
Yeah.
I haven't gone, when we did Forever Plaid or any other musicals that we've done, I haven't gone to any of the music rehearsals. And so to go to one, and the very first one was all, you were just working music. I was dumbfounded because I was going around taking photos, but then I'd also stand there and just listen, like, what are you talking about? And then how much you harped on tradition and ending. I was like, I don't understand why we need to stop on the end, but I can hear it now. I mean, I wasn't experiencing it or wasn't noticing it when you were working through with them at that time, but I could see how if everybody isn't on that same beat, it gets real choppy.
Yeah. I kind of went off the deep end a little bit on that opening number, but like, I don't know, like you have to have attention to detail anyway, but my thinking was, this is such an iconic opening number.
Right.
This is one that people have been like listening to since 1963, I think is when the show came out. People grew up watching the movie. And so, you know, here we are producing a live on stage version. It's the first thing that is sung in the show, like literally the first word that is sung in the show. And then I counted for that first rehearsal, and I want to say that in that opening number, people sing, not just speak, but like sing the word tradition, something like 30 some odd times.
Yeah.
So like, you know, you multiply 30 some odd times, or times 6 shows a week, times 6 weeks, we're going to be singing the word tradition a heck of a lot. You might as well go all in on making sure that it's exactly the way that it needs to be.
Yeah.
And like, there are some things that don't really set you up for success, because if you think about like the shape of that little melody, it's tradition, the final syllable goes up, which is going to lend itself to like feeling like the emphasis is on shun and not tradition, right? Tradition, not tradition. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, you know, I didn't really like harp and moan on about this like very much past that first rehearsal, but I really did try to kind of plant the seed in everybody's head. The emphasis is tradition, tradition. So, I mean, yeah, that was why I went a little bit off the deep end with that one word in that one opening song.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know, it seemed to me to be well worth the effort.
No, of course.
Yeah.
Other than that, in that detail work that you're doing as a music director and working with iconic music such as Fiddler on the Roof, how, I don't even know how to ask the question. Are you bringing your own style or your own voice into it in any ways? Like if whoever comes in and sees Fiddler on the Roof, what is something that we could potentially hear and know like, oh, that is a Jonathan Kraft like signature on this piece? Or are you not allowed to do that?
I mean, yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to answer this 2 different ways.
Okay.
I'm already laughing at myself here, because on one hand, I'm trying not to put any sort of personal stamp on this.
Gotcha.
Like, I would want this to be the Fiddler on the Roof that I would want to come see, you know, because again, I grew up watching the movie. I, you know, did that version of the show whenever I was 15 years old. I don't want to reinvent the wheel here. I want this to be the Fiddler on the Roof that I know and love, that everyone else knows and loves. And so, you know, it's like if you go to McDonald's, you expect a Big Mac. And like, you know, going to McDonald's is not necessarily the time to reinvent the Big Mac. You know what I mean? So on that sense, I'm really trying just to do the version of Fiddler on the Roof that we all know and love.
Gotcha.
And to answer the question another way here,
Yeah.
I'm very aware that I'm probably swinging for the version of Fiddler on the Roof that I remember from whenever I was 15 years
Gotcha,
old. Because again, that's the version that has sort of been living rent-free in my head since I was 15. So to what degree that has sort of like crept in and maybe sort of put my own signature like stamp on this production, I really can't say because I'm not consciously trying to do that, but like it's something that I am aware of in the back of my hand is probably creeping in. But like, if there is any one personal stamp that I am putting on this, it probably is that just absolute joy for this show and just absolute joyous disbelief that I get to do what I do as far as music directing and conducting this show. Because, I mean, there are very few shows I can see myself conducting for 6 shows a week for 6 weeks. I mean, I have friends on the national tour of Annie, and like I've got to visit with them when they were in Galveston a few months ago, and it's like, this is great. I don't think I could do this 8 times a week for 10 months. Like, I enjoy the show. I'm not an Annie hater, but like, I'd be good for like maybe a 2-week run of this, and that'd be it for me.
Yeah.
But like in the case of Fiddler, and like if there's anything coming across musically, I hope and I pray that it is just this absolute deep-rooted joy and affection for this musical.
Yeah.
And I mean, it is about as much fun as you could possibly have. Because I mean, I sometimes miss playing for shows that I'm music directing because piano conducting is a lot of fun, but like, man, just getting to like hang back and like wave a conductor's baton as like these incredibly gifted and talented musicians, you know, within about 6 feet of me are just throwing down on this music. And like the cast on stage is singing so joyfully and so enthusiastically. You just sort of are in the middle of that as a conductor, letting it all just wash over you. And it's like, it feels indecent that like I'm getting paid to do this. This feels like something that I should be paying people to let me do. And I can't believe I'm like allowed to do this. And this is like an obscene amount of fun. And so, yeah, if anything is coming across, I just hope that joy and that sense of fun and that sense of community is coming across.
No, most definitely. And your commitment to this piece as well. I definitely having this conversation with you, it's all really coming across. Even our conversations beforehand and then seeing you for the rehearsals and for the show, it's all there. And so I absolutely love that. I just think with like hearing that you're a music director, I mean, I come from a film background, and so I think of like directing in a like you have your own way of viewing it, and so I was imagining there was your own way of hearing it as well. But that's just so I'm glad that you have this vision of it and that you're sticking to what it was for you when you were 15, because that's ultimately like the biggest point is what brings you that joy and what brings you that nostalgia, and then when people walk in the door, they are going to feel that and they are going to hear that, and so I love all of that.
I sure hope so. And yeah, I can see how there might be a little bit of confusion with like the word director in the title music director, because it's a very different job than like the show's director, right? Their job is to really sort of like create a cohesive vision for the show, maybe make some choices, maybe go the traditional route, but just sort of like create the from 10,000 feet in the air and the top down vision for the totality of the show. Music director is much more like, how can I lead the music in a way that best serves the story? And like one of my more prominent mentors had an expression that really stuck with me for reasons that I think you'll giggle about, but he told me one time, the art must always precede and dictate the craft.
Wow. Yeah.
I was like, oh, I, Jonathan Kraft, will remember that.
Yeah, of course. Love it.
Yeah.
I'm going to hop into some lightning round questions. These are the questions I ask at the end of every episode.
I'm ready.
So first, what is one of the biggest mishaps you've had in your profession while being a music director or conducting?
Oh, goodness.
Or playing an instrument?
Do you want a mishap that I was personally, I don't want to say responsible for, at fault for, or do you want me being in a production that had a really big mishap. Which answer do you want?
I would prefer personal if you're willing to share.
Yeah, it just may not have the same resonance because it was a keyboard programming area, and
I see.
it was when I was on Cats the Musical. And I don't know if you're familiar what keyboard programming is. My sort of elevator speech is it's sort of like a PowerPoint slide presentation, but instead of slides or pictures, it's like different sounds that you're like clicking through as you're playing a show.
Yeah.
And so I was on Cats, and we finish up playing the Magical Mr. Mistopheles, which is this big, bright, shiny, like end of Act 2 number. The next number after that is Big Memory. And so I forgot to click forward out of the Mr. Mistopheles patches at the start of Big Memory. And so what should have been sounding just like gentle jellicle bells, doo 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 doo, should have sounded like that. Unfortunately, because I had forgotten to click to the next song, sounded like do 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 ba ba da da. You could see the entire band jump. You could see the entire cast kind of flinch on stage.
No.
Our music director like had a startled response, and like stuff like that happens. That's the kind of thing that you're like always terrified is going to happen.
Yeah.
And it happened to me.
No.
And I just about wanted to like crawl under the keyboard and like disappear into the floor. But you know, you had to finish the show and you got another chance to do it the very next day. And so you live and you learn. But like I'm still kind of like wincing from that because it was not subtle. It was, yeah, it was rough. I turned every kind of red.
Yeah, but mistakes are going to happen and you learn to move past them. And so thank you for sharing.
You learn to have self-compassion for yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Being our last show of the season of tradition and being a show about tradition, what is one of your favorite traditions, whether it's in your family or in your occupation or spiritually?
That is a good question. So I'm going to have to think about that for a minute because I have to confess I'm not an especially religious person. I would have to say the first thing that popped in my head is also one of the more personal ones. I would say that like no matter what time of day it is, which one of us is leaving first, I always make a point of like telling my husband goodbye in person and giving him a goodbye kiss in the morning. And he does the same for me because again, I was out with Cats the Musical and away from home for 10 months on the second one, 6 months on the first one. So I've been away from home a lot. So like there's something really meaningful about, you know, waking up with the person that you love and like making sure that you like have a meaningful goodbye to them because, you know, there were times whenever I would tell him goodbye and I know I wouldn't be seeing him again for like a month and a half or 2 months. And so I don't know if that's necessarily in the spirit of the question as you're asking me, but like, yeah, just it's really important for both of us to really fully appreciate the fact that we get to like be together in this day and age, and especially with me being gone from home as much as I have. So that was the first thing that popped into my head, and I think it's probably the most special and important.
No, that is exactly what I was looking for. So thank you for sharing that. I mean, this is a big show about tradition and and we're talking about society and we're talking about culturally moving on from traditions. But I think it's the small things that we do every day that have the biggest impact. And so I love that. And I love that you guys are cherishing each other, and especially being in a entertainment profession. Like there are times when you are away from your family for a very long time, and to come back and appreciate those moments and to really love them for what they're for. Thank you.
Very much so. Yeah, thank you.
My next question, you're the music director, so I don't know if you're allowed to pick favorites, but what is one of your favorite songs or musical numbers in Fiddler?
Oh, that's easy. The bottle dance during the end of Act 1 is one of my all-time favorite moments in all of musical theater.
Yeah.
Like, you've got that amazing clarinet solo, you've got that amazing choreography, and again, going back to 15-year-old Jonathan playing the accordion on a keyboard, the clarinet plays the first phrase, and then after the first phrase, the accordion jumps in with a counter melody that it plays with the clarinet solo. And I remember being 15 years old playing that and just thinking, I don't know how it could possibly get any cooler than this. And like, it has never gotten old through like every single production, every single performance of Fiddler that I've had. It's just like, I wait around for that bottle dance to come because the music is just so stinking good.
It's incredible. So I definitely agree. It's one of the better ones.
Oh, yes.
My final question is, why should people come see Fiddler on the Roof?
Oh, my goodness. We could talk for another 45 minutes here. I mean, just to sort of spitball a bunch of reasons. Number one, This is a classic show that has withstood the test of time, came out in the 1960s, and is just as relevant today as when it first came out. Number two, I've got to say, like, everyone working on the show is doing just a first-class job, like from the cast to the crew to the creative team to the musicians. So, I mean, this is the place to see theater, like, on a very, very high level here in town. And it's just a fun show with really, 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 really great music. If I do say so myself.
Yeah, I can confirm. Thank you, Jonathan, so much for being on this episode of By George.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for listening. Please come see Fiddler on the Roof. It is playing until August 4th. We did just add some more dates. We added July 24th and July 31st. Tickets are flying, so please make sure that you get them before they are all sold out. And we'll see you guys next time. Bye.
Bye.
This has been By George, an 80 Players at the George Theater podcast, hosted and produced by Miranda Zapes. Listen anywhere you listen to podcasts and follow us on Instagram at By George Theater. That's TheAtre. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And By George, we'll see y'all next time.
Did you know I also produced the music for the marketing campaign for this show?
Oh, you did? I completely forgot about that. Okay, now I have to ask about that. What was that process like?
That was really, really, really fun. And like sort of morphed from a couple of different ideas because like an early idea that I had is, I don't know if you remember in the film during the opening credits, there is this really impressive like violin cadenza that plays, and it's like variations on like themes from the actual show. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, it was like, oh, well, if we're going to do Fiddler on the Roof, I wonder if there's any way for us to maybe mount a performance of that like crazy hard violin solo that's connected to Fiddler that was in the opening credits here. And I ran that by Kevin Dean, who ran that by the marketing people. Mm-hmm. And ipso facto, that turned into, well, we're going to have a marketing campaign with like videos of a fiddler on the roof of the George, and we can't use the John Williams music because of rights issues. Mm-hmm. Like, well, I love Fiddler on the Roof. I tend to write music every now and then. I guess I could go ahead and write something.
Yeah.
So I just sort of like amalgamated all of the different like musical elements that I knew and loved from Fiddler and put it into this very like bright, up-tempo little like klezmer piece. I reached out to a colleague and a friend of mine named Zach Montasser, and like he and I sort of collaborated on like the actual like violin line because I have no experience playing any string instruments. I'm not as adept as I should be as far as like being able to write for string instruments. So I just like, you know, crank something out, send it to him. I was like, okay, Zach, how do we make this work for like something that's going to sound impressive but isn't going to be like crazy impossibly hard to play because we have like 3 days to get this recorded here. And so he like did some annotations and edits for me, and then next thing I know, like he was in the recording booth and out came and like it's a lot of fun.